Connected to iPhone.
What up, yo?
debuted in China. Kilu Transportation Development Group has built a 1-kilometer stretch of road that has a bottom layer of insulation, a middle layer of solar-powered batteries, and a top layer of transparent concrete. The electricity will power highway lights, cameras, and signs, but the developers are hoping that it will power electric cars and melt snow in the future. But the cost is high. It's $458 per square meter compared to $5 for a standard asphalt road. And the 1-kilometer stretch will only create enough electricity to power 93 homes for 1 year. So this has a long way to go before it becomes a thing. Shrimp pond. It took 150 million years to develop. A study of 114 species of shrimp has revealed how they're able to snap their claws. Researchers at the University of Alberta found what they call extreme biology. Shrimp evolving to make use of an air vacuum that stores and expends energy in a snap. Shrimp use the snapping motion to communicate, attack prey, and defend themselves. So that 150 million years was totally worth it. And shrimp are delicious. Millions of diabetics could benefit from a skin-like surface. Currently, diabetics have to prick their skin to monitor blood sugar levels. Not only is it painful, but it can result in infections and other complications. But researchers in Beijing have found that ultra-thin skin-like biosensors can reliably monitor glucose levels in a non-invasive way, which means more comfort and better monitoring. 20 years ago, Popo started training hero rats to detect landmines and diagnose tuberculosis, and they're getting more efficient. It takes 4 days for a lab technician to evaluate 100 samples of sputum, or for a minesweeper to cover an area the size of a tennis court. A hero rat can do either job in just 30 minutes. Research and development includes teaching rats to indicate the presence of mines by flipping a collar switch and identifying the presence of new diseases. So, thanks rats. We tend to think of robots as rigid metal creations. For now. The Kepler Research Group at the University of Colorado is developing soft robots that mirror the makeup and movements of biological muscle tissue. Soft robotics allows machines to be as forceful or gentle as they need to be, and researchers say the muscle-like electrical actuators that make industrial and commercial applications possible can be produced now for about 10 cents. Humanity has built its first platypus. The male platypus has a venomous spur on its hind feet that it uses to compete with other males for mates, but until now no one has extracted the venom. Tim Faulkner of the Australian Reptile Park successfully took a sample of venom, which includes a hormone that may be useful in treating diabetics. The world's first DJ robot is spinning in the Czech Republic. A club in Prague challenged robotics manufacturer KUKA to make a robotic arm that controls the action and can respond to the crowd. The challenge was accepted. But the robot music revolution isn't happening quite yet. The club is alternating between humans and robot DJs every hour. Do tiny sea turtles that hatch on the beach get tired when they don't make it to the water quickly enough? Researchers at Florida Atlantic University put them on a treadmill to find out. Sea turtles crawl toward the light, which means urban glows can disorient them. FAU researchers found that the turtles crawl, rest, and keep crawling even after hours of effort. They're little crawling machines, and as a wise zombie child once said, I like turtles. At Columbia University's Robotics and Rehabilitation Lab, exoskeletons are helping train people to walk again.
The goal is to be able to build and design lightweight wearable exoskeletons, an exoskeleton that doesn't have explicit joints, that can either assist them in their movement or train them so that they could eventually walk without these exoskeletons.
To come up with novel inventions in science and technology, we need to develop our own toolkits and frameworks for understanding, instead of just blindly memorizing formulas. Brilliant's interactive problems are a great way for you to really understand math and science. They have everything from number theory to mastering casino blackjack, or this one I really like that explains solar energy from the ground up. We all know that solar panels absorb the sun's energy, but what is it that they actually do? So click the link at the top of this video's description to get 20% off your annual subscription. Your brain Well, thank you. Now I'm going to leave you with an animal robot that greets a new friend in an interesting way. And as always, thanks for watching.
Small calculator, a really silent electronic, a really fast thinker, one that works anywhere on battery or plug-in, one with all the calculator know-how you'll probably ever need. Introducing the world's smallest electronic calculator from the maker of the world's most complete line, Sharp. Introducing the LC8, world's smallest electronic calculator by Sharp. Price tag to match, $345 complete. LC8, the answer.
So a giant asteroid is heading toward Earth, and you need to clear everybody out. Can you do it? Today we are going to consider ways in which you might evacuate a planet, and we might as well begin with 4 notes. First, how you do it depends entirely on how much time and technology you have. Second, it's not just about getting folks off a planet, you need some place to take them. Third, it's not just about evacuating folks, Earth is more than just people. And fourth, you also need to ask whether or not you should. I don't mean whether or not you should just abandon a planet and its people to die, but rather that in almost every case where you might want to evacuate a planet, you can more easily prevent or mitigate whatever disaster would have caused the need to leave. Alternatively, you might not have time to evacuate between when you find out about the danger and when it hits. As an example, a star might go supernova. There are no supernova candidates close enough to Earth to wipe out all life. But if there were, you'd only know if it had gone supernova for an instant before the killing effects appeared. What alerts you to this event is what kills you, no warning. Only if you had faster than light travel could you detect a supernova and warn people in time. And if you had years to prepare for the incoming event, you could arrange to put a shield between you and it. Some giant gas balloon to absorb it. A heck of a task, but nowhere near as hard as evacuating a full planet's population and ecosystem. Similarly, the Earth doesn't get hit by big asteroids very frequently, like the one that ended the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. The bigger they are, the less frequently they come, and there's a roughly inverse relationship between size and frequency. It takes a very big one to do enough damage you'd want to evacuate in advance. But if you can evacuate, that means you've got spaceships, and you could just drop a big nuke on the asteroid, blowing up or nudging it onto a new and safe trajectory. Even if you have to use several high-yield devices and want to send multiple ships for redundancy, that's still way easier than moving billions of people on those same spaceships. That's all assuming you've got some place to move them to. Though the good news is that if you have the ability to have made some other place livable for humans, you do have the potential ability to move them there. Even if we had a billion rockets to launch everyone into space right now, without some place to send them, that launch is rather pointless. And that raises the triage issue, because we often look at making some bunker to move people into during such a disaster, and doing that here on Earth. But we could potentially move some folks to a hastily built moon base instead. How you pick those allegedly lucky people is something that's very popular to look at in fiction, and we'll consider it today too, and draw different conclusions, I suspect. For my part, I'm not quite sure why everyone always figures you'd want to make sure you got your scientists off planet or into a bunker. That's always struck me as missing a key point, but we'll get to that in a bit. In such triage disaster stories, which are older than history, you have to remember you are not just needing to save humans. Noah had to bring along 2 of every animal, and we have quite a few parallel tales out of antiquity. That's a little more daunting of a task viewed in light of how many species of animals and plants we know of nowadays, especially since outside of a flood, you need to bring along the oceanic critters too. But amusingly, this is actually easier for us in modern times, since you could potentially carry all that in one briefcase. More on that in a bit too. Returning to our 4th point about whether or not evacuation is the best path, we need to know what the scenario is, the best known being the supernova and the asteroid, but there are plenty more. Most of them do actually have this same problem though, where evacuation is either not the best approach because you can prevent the disaster more easily, or just can't know about it in time to act. For example, in an alien invasion scenario, building warships might be more effective than building refugee ships, even though they'd probably get wrecked by an invader, because the problem with evacuating against an intelligent rather than natural disaster is that when they're done obliterating your planet, they can pursue the survivors. As a rule, asteroids don't get back up to chase fleeing ships. It's an amusing aspect about the difficulties of hiding things in space that the most covert way to send ships out is to send them in the general direction of the oncoming enemy, since you can at least point the engine away from them, since that's the easiest part to detect and use to determine their vector. If you send a bunch of scouts out that double as colony ships, spread over a wide angle, the ones that do get intercepted at least give you intelligence on who is approaching from what angle and how many of them there are. Also, unlike our intuition from down on the ground, it's actually way harder to chase someone fleeing generally towards you than away from you, since you have to stop and turn around, which takes huge amounts of time and energy, whereas someone fleeing away from you only requires you to tell part of your fleet not to slow down and to alter their heading a bit. Space combat is often rather counterintuitive, as we saw in the space warfare episode, and interstellar conflicts more so, as we'll see in the interstellar warfare episode next month. Another popular one is that a black hole hits a planet or gets made in a lab and starts eating it. If an actual stellar mass black hole comes coasting into our system, and they often do, since they frequently get ejected at high speed from where they were made, there's not much you can do but evacuate. That's insanely improbable. Space is huge and black holes are very uncommon, and the odds of one entering our solar system on a direct path for Earth is ridiculously slim. But they don't have to hit us to wreck the solar system, or to chuck Earth right out of the solar system. We'll save that case as an actual example of an evacuation, since moving your entire planet through interstellar space, if your star is getting ready to die, is one approach you can use. The one made in a lab, though, is not really a case for concern. You could hypothetically make a black hole in a lab. The most frequent method proposed is a Kugelblitz black hole, something we've discussed a lot as a possible type of power plant or spaceship engine. Those who remember that discussion know that small black holes don't live long, and are so tiny it's nigh impossible to stuff matter into them, exactly backwards of the usual perception of them chewing everything up. Most behavior of black holes is strictly theoretical, but if the current preferred theories are right, a lab-grown black hole would just oscillate through the planet, so small it cheerfully flew through dense rock without hitting anything, until it died. Even a decently big one, massing in around a mountain, that someone made in another system and shot at us, would just fly right through the planet, as it's only as big as an atomic nuclei, but still carrying all that mass and inertia. It would kill you if it hit you. That's a lot of gravity compacted into a tiny spot, but it would just fly through the planet and continue on its journey. You need a rather massive one without much speed relative to the planet for it to be able to get stuck down in the core and start chewing on things. And I don't think we actually have to worry about scientists accidentally crunching an entire moon into a black hole on Earth's surface. Moons are terribly hard to get into a laboratory. Depending on the size of the black hole, if you just teleported one in there, you could either all be killed 20 milliseconds later when its gravity, which travels at light speed, reaches the surface of the planet and shreds everyone from tidal forces, or it could just sit there for millions of years chewing up matter. There are very compact and small artificial ones, as mentioned, that are actually quite hard to stuff matter into faster than they spew Hawking radiation out, which at just the right size would create an equal outward pressure causing nothing to happen. That is an example of when you might have a doomed planet that you can do nothing about but have plenty of time to prepare for, even if it is absurdly improbable. And that's a key point, because again, in most of these scenarios, if you've got time to evacuate and the capacity to do so, you typically have the ability to prevent or otherwise remedy the disaster you are facing. Someone lets loose a virus or organism that is killing off your ecosystem, so you need to find a new planet and terraform it. Sounds good, but it's a lot easier to dome over and sterilize some places to be safe from it, at which point you can sterilize your planet and re-terraform it rather than do that for another planet. And if you can't isolate the organism to prevent it getting into your domes, I'm not quite sure how you'd isolate it from getting into your spaceships and terraforming equipment and just infecting that new planet. Now, the episode is about evacuating the planet, any planet, not just Earth, though that's our main focus. And I wouldn't consider it much of an evacuation if you're only getting off a tiny seed to plant elsewhere. If a hurricane hits some city, we don't evacuate it by grabbing one busload of breeding-age residents. Still, let's discuss that scenario and triage. You've got a bunker that will survive the impact or a spaceship that can carry off some folks to a moon base or space station. Fair enough, and it's better than nothing, but for some reason folks always want to fill these with our best and brightest, which makes sense, but the criteria seems a bit weird if it's including Nobel Prize-winning theoretical scientists, which for some reason seems to be the folks nobody argues about. Maybe because it's science fiction, so folks just figure the science is important. Refugees don't need theoreticians. You won't be getting any new science done for many generations, and they'll need to relearn it from books anyway, which takes up a lot less resources and space, especially digitized. You also probably don't need to keep such projects secret. I'm sure you would get a fair number of folks turn nihilistic and causing problems, but I don't think it would be as bad as we often see in films about such impending disasters. Anyway, even despotic governments tend to leak secrets like a sieve, and your typical democracy is so bad at keeping things like that quiet, I'd be impressed if they managed to keep it hushed for more than a few days. So you might as well take advantage of the options presented by an informed public to build bigger and better ships or bunkers, because it's not like you'd have a choice. Any form of evacuation or bunkering up is going to involve a lot of hard choices, of course. It is fundamentally a type of triage. You have to figure out what you can do before deciding what you can include. Ideally, you want a nice fortified and well-stocked fallout shelter in your basement, complete with copies of important reference text. But if you've got an hour to prepare for a nuclear war, building bookshelves down in your basement isn't a good use of time. How do you pick people? Lotteries are a popular option, but that's always struck me as a bit cowardly. Just a way to alleviate guilt at having to come up with a selection method and apply it. So you can tell people who don't get into the bunker, fate screwed you, not me. One modern advantage we do have, though, is that we don't have to select people for their genetics or romantic preference. because we don't have to rely on traditional means of repopulation. By default, under that, you want as big and healthy a genetic pool as you can, and preferably with most kids having half rather than full-blooded siblings. We can artificially inseminate women or even implant fertilized embryos of folks who aren't going into the bunker, so you are probably more interested in parenting skills of a person than if they've got good genes. Romantic preferences or genetic defects cease being a vital consideration. You still have plenty of others, and expertise in a given field is never going to be the sole criteria. You want to know what other skills they have. Their age matters too. Whether they are married. Are you looking at their spouse's skills as they are essentially a package? What about their kids? You have to include families, not just because you need them, but because the end of the world is going to be rough on anyone's mind. Unless they're a sociopath maybe, but I don't think you'd want to repopulate off a bunker full of sociopaths. And making someone face doomsday with their spouse or children left outside is likely to result in folks so consumed by grief they can't function. It's not a choice I'd ever want to make, so I don't know what criteria I'd design if it were up to me, but feel free to discuss it in the comments section below. I'd be curious what folks come up with. Of course, it also depends on how long you need to bunker up and what you're bunkering up against. If you've got to last a century, your profile looks a lot different than if it's just a few years. You're not selecting in the formal for parenting skills because you aren't repopulating off those initial people, just maintaining. It will be their great-grandchildren doing the repopulating. We are not stocking a bunker on Earth, of course, but one built here is going to be a good place to ride out any disaster that doesn't kill the whole planet. Easier to rebuild out of bunkers here than on the Moon or Mars, even ignoring that building and stocking those bunkers here is much easier. So there's a lot of levels to evacuation, and what you can do relies as much on your technology and preparation times as what the specific threat is. To answer the obvious question though, yes, we could get enough people off Earth to the Moon with modern technology in a fashion that would probably let them survive. Saving our records and even our ecology is ironically now the easiest part of that endeavor. It's not Noah's cargo that you need a big ship to preserve nowadays. It's enough equipment to support Noah's family to preserve some working intelligence to revive stuff later on. We can actually store DNA digitally and print stuff these days, and frozen embryos don't take up much room, nor is it that hard to keep them frozen on the Moon. So even if a species does go extinct in such a disaster, you have a chance to bring it back, if you have the DNA, sort of like in Jurassic Park, which is our Audible Book of the Month. We'll be examining how you go about resurrecting species, even if you don't have their complete DNA, in 2 weeks, along with examining some of the concepts from that novel. Needless to say, digital copies of all our history, art, and literature, even including many redundant backups, and a lot of material that probably isn't vital to humanity's continuance, won't take up much space. Fundamentally, the challenge there is making sure you have a self-sustaining colony or base. Everything else is the same as setting up a normal off-world colony, except there's no one to call on from home for help with problems or resupply or rescue. All the stuff you need to revive humanity, our civilization, and Earth's ecosystem, though, is pretty easy to pack along. It would be a heck of a challenge to set up a Moon or Mars base, and one big enough to be self-sustaining. But if it is priority number one for the entire planet, or even just one large nation, it is pretty doable even amid the chaos and economic collapses you'd expect to be going on. Remember, NASA's budget runs about 1/1000th of the US GDP, and we rarely bulk produce the stuff it needs and try to gold plate everything. In a scenario like this, you aren't building 1 or 2 of something, you're milling out thousands of them, and you don't care if 1 in 10 explodes on the pad if it lets you produce twice as many with the same efforts. I would not want to place a wager on their success with such a venture, trying to get a moon base for hundreds of people ready in maybe a couple years, designed so that they could support themselves and repair and expand it too, but I wouldn't call it hopeless odds either, and it's not like you have anything to lose by trying. As technology improves, this gets easier, and you can get a bit more ambitious too, but I would say this is the last century where humanity faces any risk of extinction by a non-intelligent agency. We've only just gotten into the game, so our current hand happens to be rather poor, but we are at least in the game nowadays. We'd have a chance of salvaging our civilization even if the planet was going to be destroyed. if we had some forewarning. Jump ahead in time, maybe even just a few decades, and extinction from any sort of natural disaster should be off the table. As I said though, an evacuation is not the same as evading extinction. The goal of an evacuation is to get at least a large percentage of your people out of any area safely, and preferably all of them and their stuff too. So what would it take to achieve that? What technologies would we need to evacuate every single person, or nearly so, along with a lot of our most prized trinkets and living rather than frozen samples of our ecology? Now, if your civilization is big enough, like if you lived inside a Dyson swarm, evacuation is easy enough. Such a civilization wouldn't notice or be hampered by several billion refugees any more than a major modern nation would be by a single person. They've got billions of ships lying around. Actually, they probably build that many every day. And their challenges aren't getting people off and housed, but how to cram the pyramids into a bulk cargo lifter, and which habitats are offering to store them. At that scale, you aren't trying to rescue people. You are trying to figure out how to peel chunks of the planet's crust off and stick them in some ring habitat without wrecking them in the process by keeping the gravity pointing in about the right direction and strength. I'll come back to that in a bit. Also, if you are surprised I'm suggesting wholesale transport of entire strips of the planet's surface, welcome to SFIA, since this is obviously your first visit here. We don't really know the meaning of over the top. As is often the case though, the hidden problem here is actually heat. If you want to get everybody off a planet in, say, a month, that would mean transporting a couple 100 million people a day, not even including any other cargo. You might have a near-endless supply of spaceships, most of which are probably not designed for landing on planets either, but the sheer heat of all those things undergoing re-entry and then blowing out millions of tons of super hot propellant to get back to orbit might kill everyone from the sheer heat they give off. To avoid that, and the problem that most of these ships probably aren't meant for landing on planets or leaving them, you need to be employing one of the options we looked at in the Upward Bound series last year. Space elevators or skyhooks and mass driver combinations, or preferably orbital rings. The good news is anybody with an existing fleet big enough to move a planetary population probably has those already. Now, you don't necessarily need a huge ship either. Again, it bears a lot of similarities to the concepts and technologies you need for normal space colonization. Humans have a volume of considerably less than a cubic meter. Our density is just a bit less than water, and water is 1 kilogram per liter or 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. So you could potentially pack a dozen or more people into a cubic meter, at least if you've got a chainsaw on hand. But if we had the technology to freeze people, or rather to unfreeze and revive them, you could presumably put people into pods of about that volume. A couple meters long, but not a meter wide and tall. In fact, your typical casket is about a cubic meter. So you need a ship that could store 7.6 billion people at the moment. And at a cubic meter each, that is a cube just under 2 kilometers on a side, or 1.2 miles, and massing at least 8 billion tons. Which is huge and massive, but actually a bit smaller and lighter than the colonial Ark ship Unity we discussed in the various interstellar travel and colonization episodes. It's also on a size and mass range with a lot of habitats we discussed building in our other episodes, and I mean modest ones like O'Neill cylinders, not the actual megastructures like Bishop rings, Banks orbitals, or megaorbites. So when your civilization is at the point it can build stuff like an O'Neill cylinder, it is at the stage where it can evacuate the whole planetary population, if you stick people into cryo or some other stasis. You wouldn't have to build much bigger to include everyone's pets and most priceless heirlooms, and the ecosystem preservation is easier. There may be a billion species, but only a small percent of that are large creatures. You don't need a lot of space for a sack of redwood seeds or frozen ants or bacteria. For most of the large critters, you do need parents, even if you've got artificial wombs to gestate embryos in. But not a lot. You do not need 1,000 frozen elephants, just frozen embryos to implant in a few. There's no genetic bottlenecking if the mother isn't related to the infants she's bearing and raising, nor they to each other. Of course, carting a blue whale into orbit is likely to be an interesting exercise, but by mass and volume, they are only the equivalent of a couple thousand humans, and you need storage for 7 billion. Needless to say, you don't freeze everyone. The unfrozen, as many as you can support, are going to be busy building up support infrastructure and habitats so we can start unfreezing people and organisms, the former of whom will go right to work building more structures and habitats. By the way, if you're curious, the total biomass of Earth is somewhere in the trillions of tons region. Nobody's got a terribly good estimate on the actual wet weight of all total life forms, but it should be on an order of about 1,000 times what humanity is. So if you wanted to rescue every organism, not just the species, your big frozen corpse cube needs to be about 10 times wider. If the Mega Freezer seems too big, you can always just decapitate everyone. We normally only freeze the heads these days, and generally speaking, the tech needed to revive people is pretty much the same needed to regrow bodies anyway. This is the first state at which I'd say you could rescue all the people on Earth, and it does require a pretty bulky orbital ring to pull it off fast, and obviously the technology to revive people from cryo. But I would guess on both being on the table before this century is out. The latter is actually harder, but you technically only need the technology to safely freeze those folks, and that would be an example where you'd want your scientists in that field to be among the best and brightest you saved, or in this case, did not turn into a popsicle. You can't store people indefinitely in cryo, though we don't know for how long yet, and it would depend on your technology. So building places to put them and feed them when you revive them and making sure you have the tech to do so is obviously your focus after that. Another possible route is to abandon biology altogether. As we discussed in the Hidden Aliens episode, if you manage to figure out how to scan and upload minds to live digitally, storage of those minds is actually not a big issue. As we discussed with mind backups in Digital Death some months back, we don't know quite how much memory is needed to store a brain, but the lower-end values make it in the affordable zone with modern tech, and even the high-end estimates were viable. I discourage folks from assuming computers and all their associated components will just keep getting better at an exponential rate, but I feel pretty comfortable assuming in a few decades we could do at least an order of magnitude or two better, and that ought to be more than enough to cram everybody's brain on a hard drive a lot more compact than a frozen body or even a head. That's assuming commercial hard drives. We can store data a lot more compact than that already, but for this kind of operation, cheap bulk production is the important part. Those are the early, cheap, and dirty ways to evacuate a planet, and again I'd be rather surprised if that was outside our ability going into the 22nd century. There are quite a few other options if one or more of those techs turns out to be way harder than we think, but that strikes me as the most plausible route. Going further into the future, if you want to avoid digital uploading, the key thing is having places to put people that can support them, that already exist, and can rapidly expand their hydroponics and air and water recycling. Keep going further ahead, and people will be talking not about evacuating the people from the planet, but the planet from the planet. It's an insane exercise in energy expenditure to try lifting up a few square kilometers of forest along with the dirt the roots are in. You need to dome over and under and on the sides like a big terrarium. Then lift that thing into orbit, probably on huge super strong tethers between orbital rings, since the heat released by whatever mega rockets you were using would roast everything nearby. Yet the actual big trick is maintaining the gravity in that area. As you lift it up into space, though not into orbit, gravity will drop a little from the altitude, but it would cease entirely if you were orbiting, of course. Then you need to take those tethers and swing the chunk of landscape in a circle to provide centrifugal spin, which the tethers can handle since it's the exact same force gravity was previously exerting on them. Trying to do that while keeping apparent gravity at about the same strength and direction is probably not going to work too well, but you ought to be able to do it without everything falling over or flying sideways. I'd say it's more trouble than it's worth, but if your civilization is actually doing this in the first place, you've probably got very different relative values, and we have gone to some pretty extreme lengths to move large, bulky human relics around safely. Obviously, a lot easier if you've got access to something like artificial gravity, but as usual, I'm trying to limit us to options inside known science, or at least not banned by it, even if that means rather extreme things in terms of size and manpower. Of course, you might decide you just want to move the whole planet, and that is doable. We've discussed some of the techniques before, and we'll probably do an episode on moving planets in the future. But the big one is that same acceleration and gravity issue once you start applying thrust. Lighting the planet so it doesn't freeze if you need to move far from the sun, potentially through interstellar space, is actually not a big concern in terms of equipment and energy compared to what is needed to get the planet moving. The issue is that a planet, especially the biosphere, isn't really well suited for rapid acceleration, which, as Einstein taught us, is effectively the same as gravity. Move some people on a platform and maybe a tenth of a G, and they'll notice it but be fine. Move an ocean like that, and walls of water are going to hit your coast and stay there till you stop. This is what causes our tides, after all. Now, the force exerted by the moon on Earth is probably reasonably safe to use, and maybe a bit higher, so I will say 10 micro-Gs, or 0.1 millimeter per second. Doesn't sound like much, and it really isn't. It would take 3 hours to get up to walking speed, and 1,000 years of continuous acceleration to get up to 10% of light speed. Probably about as fast as you'd ever want to move a planet, even if you wrapped around in shielding and point defense systems to deal with cosmic radiation and collisions. The amount of energy needed to move a planet is vastly larger than what you need to light it if you could no longer use the sun, unless you are going a lot slower, making the trip to a new solar system take 1,000,000 years rather than a few thousand. You'd probably push it up to speed with lasers powered by the sun, and down with lasers some colony fleet had built at the destination, with some very shiny mirror sphere around the planet. But alternatively, you could build a thick-walled sphere around the planet to fill with fusion fuel and provide shielding. Hollow spheres exert no net gravity on things inside them, so it can be as massive as you need without bothering Earth, though you would need to use a lot of active support to keep that sphere a sphere and transmit that pushing force around evenly. But that's your final option if you want to evacuate the whole planet in a very literal sense. Just pack up and move to another solar system. Everything we discussed today is pretty extreme, even if the degree of difficulty between the options is immense, mountains next to molehills, but is inside the realms of known science. Obviously, other technologies might make it much easier, but we can see that as immense as the task is, it is actually doable. You can evacuate Earth if you need to. Next week, we will be looking at various cosmological theories for the fate of the universe, from heat death to the Big Rip or Big Crunch, and many others. As it's a longer topic, we will be doing a two-parter, and we'll be joined by astrophysicist Paul Sutter, with part 2 over on his channel immediately following part 1. The week after that, we will explore the notion of resurrecting dead species and some novel approaches to ecological preservation. For alerts when those and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and share it with others. You can also support our content over on Patreon. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a great week. There is a theory which states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it is here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable. So today, we will be looking at a number of the models predicting the eventual fate of the universe. As you can imagine, this is a fairly complex topic, so we will be joined today by Dr. Paul M. Sutter, an astrophysicist with Ohio State University. It is also quite a long topic, so this will be a two-part episode, and you can watch part 2 over on Paul's channel, which is also an excellent place to visit to learn more about cosmology in general. To discuss the end of the universe, we might as well start with the beginning, both where it came from and how human thought on this matter has evolved as we learned more. The Big Bang Theory was proposed almost a century ago and has solidified its status since then, but people have been thinking about the origin of the universe for at least as long as we've had recorded history. They obviously didn't have the same resources we have nowadays, but typically drew 3 basic conclusions that remained popular up to modern times. Since the world around them could be seen to change on a daily basis, but not necessarily all that much or significantly, they tended to conclude either the universe at one point did not exist, or it has always existed and changes are cyclical, like the sunrise or tornado seasons, or that at a grand scale it pretty much doesn't change at all. Which is to say, snow may fall or melt on a mountain, trees might grow on it and die, but the mountain is unchanged and so is the world it sits on. It's easy for us to look back to antiquity and how little they knew about science and dismiss their thoughts on this topic, but it still lays out the conversation we've had in more modern times and are still discussing. If the universe began, then how did that happen? Who acted or what occurred to make that happen, and what came before? If there was something before, was it like now, and are we just repeating things in an endless cycle like the seasons? And if it has always been around, how is it getting renewed? Because you can look at the forest on a mountain changing and say it changes but the mountain does not, but eventually you will notice that the mountain gets eroded. Rain comes down and washes dirt away, and while you can see water evaporate and rise into clouds, you can also see rocks tumble down a mountain but never float back up. Talking about how these things began inevitably leads to asking how they will end. Will everything just keep being renewed constantly or reset in some cycles, or just wear down one day? Needless to say, folks had a lot of notions for how things would begin and end, and they did tend to fit into one of those 3 options, even if the specific theory was that Earth was a disk riding around on the back of a turtle shell or elephants. With the emergence of formal logic and philosophy, we've got quite a few appearing. Aristotle suggested that the universe was finite in size, centered on Earth, but infinite in time. This geocentric model would later be refined by Ptolemy and stick around till Copernicus, though even in Aristotle's time, a heliocentric model had emerged from Aristarchus, and interestingly, Archimedes had calculated the universe to be a light year in radius. It is of course far larger than that, but it's worth remembering how shockingly huge that is. Archimedes had no idea what speed light traveled at, but he knew how big that distance he calculated was, and it meant he thought the universe was 1 billion times wider than the planet, and contained 1 billion times the volume. We now know it's at least several billion times wider than even that, but it meant even then they'd come to realize just how tiny Earth was, even if they gave it center stage. This doesn't get covered much, but it should be, as Archimedes' calculation of this in his paper The Sand Reckoner is considered to be the first research expository paper, and actually used Aristarchus' heliocentric model. We knew the sun moved in the sky, as did the planets. That's the origin of their name, as planet means wanderer. We also had discovered the concept of parallax by then, and the stars didn't seem to experience it. Indeed, it would be 2,000 years before Frederick Bessel first successfully measured the parallax of a star in 1838.
Archimedes, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Aristarchus were all wrong, of course, but Copernicus wasn't actually right, and indeed, since we can see equally far in all directions, the observable universe is actually centered on Earth and geocentric, but that's a fairly irrelevant status. every observer is centered in their observable bubble. We don't want to get in the habit of thinking, though, that Copernicus was smart and right and arguing that his predecessors and opponents were stupid and wrong. Rather, they were quite smart too, and Copernicus was just less wrong. As we go through these theories, which each radically alter how we view the universe as we get some new piece of evidence, only to be replaced sometime later as we got new evidence, we do not want to view the advocates of the previous theories as drooling morons arguing against their clear illuminating light of reason and evidence. So prior to Copernicus, the main theory was the universe was infinite in age, or if not, had been created at some point more or less as it was now and would continue on as it was. But also finite if huge in size, although nowhere as big as we currently understand it. Over the next century, his modified form of this started catching on, but took a hit when Newton's law of universal gravity both cemented the heliocentric model, providing a mechanism to explain the motion of the planets, but also kind of killed it.
If every body in the universe exerts gravity on each other, then they ought to fall together over time. And needless to say, if the universe was infinitely old, there's been more than time enough for that. So from Newton's work, we were faced with 4 possible solutions. First, the universe is not infinitely old and appeared at some point all spread out and is falling in. This gives us a potential fate of the universe, backwards of the Big Bang, that it began huge and will end when everything eventually slams together. Second, that gravity is not an entirely inverse square force, but gets even weaker at great distances, so that we are not pulling on those stars. Indeed, this option has remained a common theory until modern times, and we see it in something called MOND, Modified Newtonian Dynamics, one of the popular explanations for dark matter until very recently. If gravity basically just ceases at some distance, then you don't have to worry about stars falling together. Third, that something is holding those stars from falling together, resisting gravity, akin to the old notion of angels holding them on a celestial sphere. And this was never too popular, and amusingly, the discovery of dark energy pushing the universe apart makes this the only one of the 4 interpretations to still have some validity nowadays. And fourth, that the universe is infinite in both age and size, or at least size. 16th century mathematician and astronomer Thomas Digges first suggested this one, that the stars were not at a fixed distance on a shell, but spread out over varying distances all the way out to infinity, what is now called the static universe model. He also first noticed the dark night sky paradox, later known as Olber's paradox, even though Olber wouldn't be born for a couple more centuries. If everything is spread out over an infinite volume, then nothing is moving because there's always more stuff in the opposite direction pulling it that way too. This one gained a lot of traction, and its main flaw was the aforementioned Olber's paradox, which points out that in an infinite universe, any specific direction you look will eventually be obstructed by a star. So the night sky shouldn't be black with a few lights twinkling in it, but a uniform shade of light. We'd be surrounded by stars and feel like we lived inside a massive sun. Indeed, were that the case, everybody should be burned to death, and if the universe were not infinitely old. As Roman discovered, light needed time to travel and its approximate speed in 1676. So we could predict that the eventual doom of the universe would be the sky getting brighter and brighter as ever more distant light arrived until we eventually burned to death. Each of these perspectives had a lot going for it and against it in the 17th century and on to the 18th. As we move into the 19th century, though, we had a few new developments. We had begun to assume stars were not all fixed on some sphere and that the Earth did not orbit the Sun, so we could use that movement to engage in some very wide parallax measurements. As mentioned, Bessel managed to get the first measurement of a distance to a star, 61 Cygni, in 1838, and 2 of his contemporaries, Struve and Henderson, managed to do the same for Vega and Alpha Centauri at about the same time. We managed to measure around 100 more in short order, but couldn't for many others. We can see a lot more stars than that with the naked eye and had telescopes by now, so this inability to measure them told us they were very far away. We had another development in this period too, which was thermodynamics. Energy is conserved, but entropy is not. We had no idea what made the stars hot yet, but we knew they were and should be cooling down. and that if they weren't, they were presumably being fueled some way, and that fuel should be finite. We already had a lot of philosophical arguments for why the universe couldn't be infinite in age, but we also had the same problems for why it couldn't be finite either. But thermodynamics and the speed of light piled on to make this much harder. If the universe is infinite in size and age, then we should be cooked by Olber's paradox. And we would need to know what fueled the stars. If the stars simply formed hot at some point in the past, then they would eventually cool off and we'd freeze to death at the end of the universe instead. We were starting to get a decent idea how old Earth was then too. This is when we start getting the first formal scientific theories for the beginning and ending of the universe, as we had to wrangle with these new issues and an increasingly large map of the universe. Keep in mind at this point we had no idea what powered the stars, how old any of them were, or that they had different ages, or what galaxies were. Everybody knew the problems with the static universe model, the one that reasoned the universe was infinite in size and age, but it was sort of the default because alternatives had many problems too, and none had any real evidence. Indeed, Einstein would offer up a modified form of the static universe model in 1917, a decade after he unveiled special relativity. As mentioned, many had thought the universe might be finite in age but infinite in size, but he went the other way and said it was infinite in age but finite in size. This is also when we start seeing folks talk about the universe having curvature or being flat. No surprise, since relativity had started the conversation on space and time being curved. In a traditional Euclidean universe, two long parallel lines stretching out to infinity will remain the same distance, like a pair of railroad tracks. For all that they look like they're converging to our eyes, you can walk alongside them and see them remain the exact same distance apart. In a non-flat universe, this isn't true. They might grow closer together or further apart, even though they are 100% straight. That's not our focus yet, and we didn't know that the universe was expanding yet either. Now, what was different that Einstein thought the universe would be infinite in size but not in time? There was no Hubble redshift yet to indicate that after all. This is, incidentally, related to what Einstein called his biggest blunder, and that was the cosmological constant, a basic energy density or pressure to space, even in total vacuum. As mentioned, if the universe is finite in size, then gravity should yank everything together. So if it is finite in size, either gravity had to disappear after a certain distance, or the universe couldn't be that old and had to start big, or something was pushing them apart. We had gotten enough astronomy by now to be able to see stars pulling on each other with gravity, with no indication it was weakening more than Newton said it should, so that seemed out. So if it was infinitely old, something had to be pushing those stars apart, and that was the ridiculous cosmological constant, his fudge factor and blunder that he dismissed after Hubble expansion was found a decade later. We had to bring it back more recently, but we'll get to that later.
For Einstein's version of the static universe to be true, it needs to explain a few things, but we only knew of one at the time he suggested it, and that was entropy. Any model suggesting the universe was infinitely old, has always been and would always be, has to explain why we still have stars and what's replenishing their fuel. Or if not replenishing them, what was producing the matter for new stars and what was happening to the old, cold, dead ones, which should otherwise accumulate to fill the whole universe over infinite time. This is hardly a death blow, though, since one can assume matter eventually resets, like shuffling a deck of cards will keep further randomizing it, increasing its entropy, but eventually return you to the original state, resetting that entropy. And possibly new matter just appeared from nowhere and old matter just slid into nowhere on a regular basis. Sounds a bit silly, but considering the alternative is that it all just appeared from nowhere at the same time, it's essentially on the same footing. It's kind of hard to say tons of matter can appear from nowhere at one initial moment, but that can't do that later on, nor the reverse and just disappear.
The other two flaws came later. One was intergalactic redshift, which came up shortly after this and caused Einstein to abandon the model. And the other was cosmic microwave background radiation, which was still about 50 years off. Hubble didn't discover redshift of stars, that had already been noted. Some were redshifting, indicating they were moving away, and others were blue shifting, indicating the reverse. What got noticed is that very distant objects, galaxies, were almost all redshifting, and that the further off they were, the more they were. This, of course, was the origin of the Big Bang Theory, since if galaxies are all moving away, and faster the further off they were, that would imply they used to be a lot closer. This was the exact opposite of the problem with the static universe, which assumed the universe needed to be bigger in the past if it were not either infinite in size or had some force keeping stars from falling together. Its big rival for quite some time was the steady state model that evolved from the static universe version. They are not the same, and folks often incorrectly assume steady state is the old model that the Big Bang replaced. Rather, the steady state model was proposed in 1948, a couple of decades after the Big Bang Theory. In the steady state model, we already knew that stars formed and were fueled and died, and we could see that intergalactic redshift. So it suggests the fuel for stars is constantly appearing in little bits and pieces, and that the universe is indeed expanding, but remains essentially the same and has always been and will always be. That's not as contradictory as it maybe sounds, and in a non-expanding universe, you end up with a clutter of dead stars, as new matter appears to make new stars. But if it's constantly expanding, then you have new room for stuff to be. And again, the notion that single particles of hydrogen are emerging from nowhere is no worse than new bits of space emerging from nowhere constantly, which both Big Bang and steady state claim happens, or that all that hydrogen emerged in one single flash of a moment. Now, you might be thinking you'd be able to detect new bits of matter emerging all over the place, but keep in mind that our sun has several cubic light years to itself and several billion years of life. So the 10 to the power 57 AMU of mass, or hydrogen particles, making up a new one, would only require 10 to the 40th of them emerge each second, and spread over some 10 to the 49th cubic meters, or one appearing every second in a cubic kilometer. Needless to say, spotting a single hydrogen atom appearing in a cubic kilometer in a given second is not exactly easy to do, especially back then. So Big Bang says all the matter appeared at once many billions of years ago, but space is constantly expanding. Steady state argues matter is constantly appearing, and so is space. There's no problem, by the way, with an infinite object expanding. Twice of infinity is still infinity, but it can get bigger. And indeed, that's permitted under the Big Bang, too, which just says those parts of the universe close enough for us to see used to be finite in size or even point-like. We don't know that the whole universe might not be infinite in size, and might have begun that way, too. We just know it's much bigger than the parts we can see, and that those used to be way smaller. So throughout the 1940s and 50s, both models were quite popular with scientists. The first hard hit to steady state was the discovery of quasars, which in general are much more common the further from Earth you get, which means they were much more common in the past. They don't get less common closer to Earth because our region of the universe had fewer of them, but rather because they are almost all gone these days, and we can only see the old ones because the light is just reaching us. In the steady-state model, the universe is expanding and gaining new bits of matter, but is basically the same over time. So finding a feature of the universe that has significantly changed over time strongly implies the universe is not steady and stable in its composition over time. So by the time we discovered cosmic microwave background radiation in 1964, steady state had already become the minority view of cosmologists, though still had a number of supporters. Initially, it wasn't too bad a blow, as one plausible explanation could be that it was light from ancient stars that had been scattered around by galactic dust. However, as we mapped it out better, it became increasingly clear that it was evenly spread in all directions, so whatever was causing it had nothing to do with our galaxy.
When the universe was a good deal younger and a good deal more dense, basically a big hot plasma, light was constantly being emitted by it but scattering right away. Just one big white-hot fog of hydrogen plasma. As the universe expanded and cooled, it eventually cooled enough to allow protons and electrons to bond to form neutral hydrogen gas instead, which no longer interacted with all that light as easily. That light took off in every direction without constantly slamming into things and scattering. For the first time, the universe became transparent. The light was emitted all across the universe, sailing off in all directions, and is now, 13.8 billion years later, arriving at every spot of space, since you can always draw a sphere around any given object, like Earth, that is just wide enough for light from that moment to be arriving. We call this the surface of last scattering, and expect it to keep getting bigger and weaker till the end of time. Nowadays it's microwaves, hence cosmic microwave background radiation, or CMB. In the past it was stronger infrared waves, long down the road it will be weaker radio waves.
That was predictable by the Big Bang Theory, but not by steady state or static models. So it didn't quite kill them, but it locked the Big Bang in as the overwhelming consensus model. It still isn't the only one, and it predicts multiple possible ends for the universe, from Big Rip to Big Crunch. But it's essentially the state of play for the last several decades till now, and still running strong. We'll be exploring those scenarios and some more evidence for the Big Bang in Part 2, and some more modern competing theories, but as I said, steady state didn't die entirely. And indeed we got something called the quasi-steady state model, or QSS, in the early 90s, which adjusted steady state to include mini-bangs, for instance. Instead of matter appearing in bits and pieces constantly, it pops up in Big Bang events scattered far apart in time, but more like raindrops falling on a pond. Issues with this include why we can't see stuff older than the Big Bang, or local mini-bang, but indeed we often have had objects or structures that at least initially appeared older than the universe. This was particularly popular in what is called plasma cosmology, a theory of modest popularity in the 80s and 90s that was a variation on steady state in the sense of the universe having always been and always being, with no end. Like many such models, it didn't handle things like quasars or cosmic microwave background radiation very well. But as we reached more modern times, we also had to deal with both dark matter and dark energy, and we'll look at the impact of those as we move into Part 2. Just follow the link to Part 2 over on Paul Sutter's channel. We'll be back again next week to discuss de-extinction of species and high-tech ecosystem preservation. For alerts when that and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to subscribe to Paul's channel while you're over there for Part 2, and hit the like button for both episodes. We'll see you next week.
Welcome to a very special edition of Ask a Spaceman. Not only special because I gave my chalkboard its annual cleaning and it's still drying, but because this is a part 2 of a collaboration with Isaac Arthur called Compendium of Doom. If you haven't already seen part 1, there's a link down there. You should probably watch it, otherwise this part is not going to make any sense at all. And, you know, there's a good chance this won't make sense anyway, but definitely part 1 is going to help. So, click that link if you already haven't watched part 1. Don't worry, I'll wait here for you. Alright, welcome back. Now, in that episode, in part 1, Isaac and I talked about how the Big Bang Theory came to be, how it became the dominant theory of cosmology of the history and evolution of our universe. But that's the past. And I want to talk about the future. And talking about the future in cosmology is actually pretty straightforward. It's a pretty simple game. Not necessarily an easy game, but a simple game. And that simple game is because of general relativity. We use general relativity to understand the evolution of the universe. And general relativity is very, very simple. You connect the matter and energy contents in a system, whether that system is the solar system, or around a black hole, or a galaxy, or the universe itself. You connect the matter and energy contents to the geometric curvature of that system, and then that geometric curvature tells us how the matter and energy contents move around. This applies in the solar system, around black holes, around galaxies, and in the universe itself. That's why you may have heard, if you've read up on future fates of the universe, things like closed or flat or open universes. These refer to geometries. These refer to how parallel lines will behave on the very, very largest scales. And we're interested in that because the geometry of the universe tells us about what the universe is made of, and vice versa. And those two together tell us how the universe will evolve. So, for example, if there's a lot of stuff in the universe, if we're just overflowing with matter, then the gravitational attraction of that matter is enough to eventually halt our current era of expansion and reverse it and crunch the universe back down. That is a fate of the universe called Big Crunch, and that the geometry that connects to that is called closed geometry. Likewise, if there's not enough stuff in the universe, if there's only a little bit of matter floating around, then it can never halt the expansion, and expansion will continue to accelerate forever. We call that an open universe. Geometry is connected to contents. And then there's the third possibility, which is the most interesting, which is the case of what's called a flat universe, where parallel lines stay perfectly parallel through all of space and time. And in this case, there's just enough matter to overcome expansion, so the expansion will slow down and coast to a stop. Technically, it'll take an infinite amount of time to actually reach velocity zero, so it's always kind of expanding, but the expansion rate is always slowing down. That's the fate of a flat universe. And in the 90s, there were huge debates among astronomers and cosmologists about what the universe was made of, what its curvature was, and what its ultimate fate was. These were all the same questions. They were all interconnected. One group of astronomers, one group of observations was saying there's not enough stuff. We live in an open universe. It's going to continue expanding forever. But another set of observations, mostly based on the cosmic microwave background, was saying, no, the universe is flat. We're actually right on that line. So yeah, it will continue expanding, but it will slow down as time goes on. And this was, I can't even begin to describe how big of a debate this was in the cosmological and astronomical community, because we had two sets of observations that did not agree with each other. And Isaac Arthur is about to tell us about an interesting discovery that made all the observations agree with each other and totally set the stage for a brand new paradigm. So take it away, Isaac.
Probably the biggest development in terms of us discovering how the universe will end in the last few decades was dark energy. We already knew the universe was expanding and something had to be driving that. But in the late 1990s, we began getting a very large collection of distant supernovae. Supernovae come in a variety of forms and are so bright they can be seen in distant galaxies. But one of those types, type 1a, which is when a white dwarf remnant detonates after accumulating material from a binary companion, releases a very characteristic blast in terms of energy and profile. By gathering up dozens of these events, we could chart out how far away they were and how much they were redshifting, how fast they are moving away from us. This lets us get a fairly accurate measurement of how quickly the universe was expanding, and we found to our surprise that the expansion wasn't remaining constant, or even slowing down as we'd expect if gravity were tugging on such galaxies and pulling them back, potentially causing an eventual big crunch. But rather that cosmic expansion was actually speeding up. Accelerating expansion causes some serious problems for virtually every prior cosmological model discussing the eventual fate of the universe, and also introduced the possibility that it might keep getting faster and faster and eventually rip apart even galaxies, stars, or possibly even atoms themselves. This model, the Big Rip, which we'll get into in a bit, represents an entirely new end for the universe, being shredded down to subatomic particles.
Thanks, Isaac. That's a great summary of this major discovery of dark energy, the name we give to the accelerated expansion of the universe. We live in a universe with dark energy. We can't escape that observational fact. We live in a universe with accelerated expansion. It is totally flat. It's totally flat, but the expansion of the universe is accelerated. What does this mean for the long-term fate of our universe? Well, let's start talking about what we can see. What we can see. We see stars in the sky, we see nearby galaxies, and then we see very, very distant galaxies. And to live in an expanding universe, it means that every galaxy gets further away from every other galaxy. It also means that the further away a galaxy already is, the faster it appears to recede from us. And that means eventually you reach a point, like, if a galaxy is twice as far away, it's receding twice as fast, 4 times as far, 4 times as fast, etc., etc. And eventually you reach a point where there are galaxies, distant galaxies, that are receding so fast, they're receding faster than the speed of light. No, that's not a problem, but that's another episode to talk about that. What it means is that these galaxies are outside of causal contact. It means we cannot ever touch those galaxies. We can build the biggest, baddest rocket ship you can possibly imagine, blast off as fast as you can go. You will never, ever catch up with that galaxy. But we see it because the light from that galaxy left the galaxy a long time ago. And we're just seeing the image. It's like we're getting a postcard of that galaxy, but that galaxy is already across the ocean. It's already in another country. It's already on vacation. It's not calling. It's not picking up its phone. It cut itself. It's off the grid. It's not talking to us, but we got a postcard from when it left. And this sphere of the galaxies that we're in causal contact with, like if we really, really wanted to, we could reach out and go to Andromeda. Super hard, but we could do it. The most distant galaxies that we can see, we can never visit them. And that sphere grows smaller and smaller and smaller as the expansion of the universe accelerates. It pulls these galaxies outside of causal contact, outside of our bubble that we're allowed to affect. And it also means that the light from the galaxies that we still can see gets redshifted, gets stretched more and more. So right now we look around, we see galaxies in visible light. The most distant galaxies are already more shifted into the infrared. If you've ever wondered why James Webb Space Telescope can be an infrared telescope, that's exactly why, but that's another episode too, feel free to ask. And given time, say, I don't know, hundreds of billions of years, these galaxies will stretch out even more. The light from the galaxies will stretch out even more, where they'll go down into the radio, and then they'll be emitting light that the wavelength is equal to like the width of the observable universe, which means you can't see it at all. And that means galaxies disappear. Galaxies disappear. So even though the universe is getting bigger with time, our observable patch is getting smaller. All that will be left will be what's called the local group of galaxies. And Isaac's going to come back to tell us what's going to happen to those remnants.
As we discussed in part 1, one of the flaws of most early cosmological models developed after Newton's law of gravity was that only in an infinite universe would material fail to fall together from gravity over time. While cosmic expansion mostly dealt with that issue, it remains the case that gravity is a strictly attractive force, and at a galactic scale is pulling all the stars and neighboring galaxies together. Our own galaxy is quite the cannibal, and eaten many smaller galaxies down the eons. And of the 54 galaxies in what we call the local group, only Andromeda matches us in size, and these 2 galaxies form the approximate middle of the local group. Those galaxies which are gravitationally bound together, and which we expect to stay that way, rather than flying away as more further ones do. You've probably heard that we are set to merge with Andromeda in a few billion years, but indeed we should end up merging with all of them as one massive galaxy. In fact, there's a chance that the third largest galaxy in the local group, the Triangulum Galaxy, might end up merging with the Milky Way or Andromeda before they do, and won't be far behind. The rest of the galaxies in the group will slowly be eaten up too, and on a timeline fairly close to when all other galaxies beyond the local group will have fled beyond the cosmological horizon from expansion, leaving just one supergalaxy in the ocean of the night. While this is a long while off, it will occur long before star formation rates have begun dropping off. Most stars and planets yet to be born will live and die in a period when there is only one giant galaxy and no others to be seen beyond.
Thanks again, Isaac. It's important to keep in mind that the timescales we're talking about now are ridiculously long. I mean, hundreds of billions of years long. The universe has only been around for 13.8 billion years, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of years, so multiple times longer than the universe has already existed, long after our sun is already dead. These are the processes that are taking place. Distant galaxies will be ripped from view. Anything that's not in the local group gone, see you later, never gonna see you again. And then the galaxies that do remain in our local group, like Isaac said, are all gonna merge together into one big, messy clump of galaxy. Over those same time scales, the stars that make up that galaxy are gonna shift character because stars are gonna die off. Stars are gonna die off because in order to make a star, you need enough gas, dust, stuff to squeeze down into a very dense point such that nuclear fusion ignites. That's a pretty rare circumstance. And in an old universe that's cooler, that's thinner, that's less dense, those opportunities aren't going to be as common. Get this. We're already past the peak of star formation. Already, today, right now, there are fewer stars being born every year in our universe than there were 5 billion years ago. We're already past the peak, and it's only downhill from here. And the stars that do get made, they won't be the big blue, white stars. They won't even be stars like our own sun. There just isn't enough material left. It will be the small red dwarfs that will be manufactured. And this means that at a certain point, the last star in the universe will be born. We're not exactly sure. It's a little bit tough because, this is pretty complicated physics, predicting star formation right in the distant future. Somewhere between 1 and 100 trillion years from now. Somewhere between 1 and 100 trillion years from now, the last star will be born. It will be a small red dwarf star. It will have a lifetime of, 10 or 20 trillion years. These small stars can live very, very long times. But now we're talking about long times, so it doesn't really matter. Somewhere around 120 trillion years from now, the last star will die. The last star will die. Nuclear fusion will cease. There will still be random collisions of brown dwarfs or neutron stars where you'll temporarily get enough mass to reignite nuclear fusion somewhere like 100 at any given time in the remnants of the merged galaxy. 100 trillion years from now, 200 trillion years from now, there might be 100 stars shining, tops. But for all intents and purposes, after 120 trillion years, it's the end of the star forming time, epoch, era in our universe. After that, we pass into what we call the degenerate era. So this current era that we live in now is known as the stelliferous era, the star forming era. And then we pass into the degenerate era. It's just the leftovers. It's white dwarfs, which, by the way, have now cooled down to close to absolute zero, so they're more like black dwarfs. There's neutron stars. There's black holes. There's the never got to be a planet, so there's still clouds of gas and dust hanging around. There's planets themselves. There's brown dwarfs. It's just a dim, cold, empty universe that doesn't have a lot of light, doesn't have a lot of warmth. And over the next tens of quintillions of years, now we're going to ridiculously long time scales, you have this dead, decaying lump of a galaxy that's all isolated, all completely isolated in its universe. It can't see any other galaxy. There'll be chance interactions, like two failed stars, two brown dwarfs might come pass by each other, and one might get enough energy to kick it out of the galaxy. Once it's outside the galaxy, then it's gone. Because outside of the gravitational bubble of our own galaxy, the rest of the universe is completely and totally dominated by dark energy. So once that escapes, that accelerated expansion rips it apart. And one by one by one, every macroscopic object in our galaxy evaporates. It leaves. It gets kicked out just by chance interactions. It takes an incredibly long amount of time, tens of quintillions of years, which is a long time, but it's bound to happen. Anything that doesn't get out, maybe like 10% or so, survives all these interactions, they'll eventually accrete down into the central supermassive black hole. And so that all that will be left in our own spot in the galaxy will be the central supermassive black hole. All other macroscopic objects get isolated into their own little bubble universes, carried away by accelerated expansion. That means if you were somehow still alive and somehow still sitting on a planet, well, there'd be no star, there'd be no sun in your sky, there would be no other stars, there would be no other galaxies, there would be no nebula, you would be barely above absolute zero, you would be completely and totally isolated in your universe. Nothing else. Nothing else. You wouldn't even know that this current epoch, the epoch we live in the universe, even happened. You would look around and you'd see your heavy elements. You'd have your iron, your carbon. You'd wonder how iron and carbon got here. But it's too cold for like nuclear fusion, and there's not enough gravitating objects. You wouldn't know. You just wouldn't know. That's the crazy part. In the far distant future, you wouldn't even know the current era existed. There'd be nothing left. After 10 to the 30 years, this is when each macroscopic object essentially sits in its own bubble universe, its own observable bubble. And then it gets weird. It gets weird because macroscopic objects themselves, over these incredible time scales, start to break down. They break down because at the fundamental level, at the microscopic level, things are ruled. Physics is ruled by quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is all about probabilities and chance. Usually we don't worry about that. But if you give an object like 10 to the 30 or 40, 50, 10 to the 100 years, weird stuff is bound to happen. Like a little molecule just might spontaneously disassociate, because why not? Or a proton might just leave an atomic nucleus and decay, and then it becomes unstable and keeps decaying. Macroscopic objects will just dissolve. And at the extreme long end of the universe, far, far distant time scales, the universe is just fundamental particles. Black holes are going to evaporate through Hawking radiation. Give them enough time and they will. Neutron stars are going to dissolve. White dwarfs / black dwarfs are going to dissolve. The planets are going to dissolve. And you're just left with a cold, thin, expanding soup of fundamental particles, of photons, electrons, neutrinos. That's it. And then each one of those eventually gets ripped apart by this ridiculous accelerated expansion of dark energy. And it's just one electron in its own little universe over here, one photon over here in its own little universe, one neutrino over here in its own little universe. That's it, slowly approaching absolute zero. We call this the heat death of the universe, because as time goes on, temperature differences go to zero and everything cools to absolute zero. And with no heat differences, there's no work that can be done, no thermodynamic exchange, which means no chemistry, no interesting physics, no neurological processes. So it really is like a death, because nothing can happen. If there's no heat differences, then nothing can happen physically, fundamentally, physically. And I know that's kind of sad. It's like a bummer outlook. Thankfully, it's way far in the future. And like I said, this is the most likely scenario. This is what we know based on our current understanding of physics, based on our current understanding of what dark energy and dark matter is, what our universe is made of. And there are some other possibilities. There are some other possibilities because we're not exactly sure what dark energy is going to do, because we haven't totally really measured it very well. One possibility that might change this outcome is that if dark energy actually increases with time. Right now we think it's constant, the acceleration of the universe is constant, but what if the acceleration itself gets worse and worse? That means that not only will distant galaxies get ripped apart from us, it will also eventually overwhelm our local group. It will eventually overwhelm our own galaxy. It will eventually overwhelm solar systems, molecular bonds, atomic bonds, nuclear bonds. As that acceleration keeps ramping up, the universe just rips itself apart. And we call this the Big Rip. And if that happens, if that is the outcome of our universe, this can happen on relatively quick timescales, somewhere around 10 billion years. Which is like nothing compared to the heat death where we had like 10 to the 30, 10 to the 100 years to work stuff out. 10 billion years is nothing. That means we're already halfway to the end of the universe, which is kind of difficult to think about. Again, we're not sure because we haven't measured dark energy well enough to know if it really is constant or if it's changing with time. Or because we don't fully understand dark energy, we don't know what it's made of, it could transform itself. Whatever's powering the accelerated expansion could just transform, maybe flood the universe with a new set of particles, maybe do something else. We're not exactly sure. Isaac's going to come back one last time to share with us what that might entail. Take it away, Isaac.
While we have had many a model for the end of the universe get expunged, with overwhelming evidence against, and many more developed, one of the most popular of these was the Big Crunch, the notion that gravity would eventually slow down cosmic expansion and drag everything back together again, ending the universe as a super hot and compact, fiery death. A variation of this called the Big Bounce explores a cyclical approach, where it crunches all the way back down to a point and then explodes as a new Big Bang. Rinse and repeat. While the accelerating expansion evidence would at first seem to kill the Big Crunch off as a theory, it has gotten some second looks. Just as the Big Rip suggests dark energy could push apart even faster and grow stronger and stronger till it rips apart even atoms, it is possible it could fall off over time. Should it weaken, we get the opposite of the Big Rip, a slowdown and potential eventual collapse, Big Crunch 2.0. In such a model, the collapsing universe would heat up as it collapsed, potentially allowing us to tap that contraction for energy to run civilizations up till nearly the end. Of course, a lot of this depends on the concept of vacuum energy, something we still don't understand too well, and it offers us one last option for the fate of the universe, that we might simply undergo vacuum decay and pop right out of existence.
So like Isaac said, the future fate of the universe depends, really critically depends on what dark energy is going to do. And since we don't fully understand dark energy, we don't fully understand the fate of the universe. What I outlined, the heat death, is if dark energy stays constant. But even then, there are some escape hatches. Like, if you give a random patch of the universe that's complete and total vacuum, we know that there's 0-point energy, that it's vibrating with the fundamental quantum fields, there's this base energy to the universe. If you give it long enough, like, I don't know, 10 to 100 years or whatever, it just might randomly fluctuate, like, and spawn a new Big Bang. A new epoch of inflation. Maybe, kind of, sort of, it's kind of hard to tell. In that case, the universe would continue just based on these random fluctuations that each child universe eventually peters out, but give it a long enough time and it'll spawn a new universe. Maybe, kind of, sort of. Maybe the death of the universe is a little bit more exotic. Maybe our current universe isn't in its ground state. Maybe our current universe, with our current set of four forces and particles and fields that make up physics as we know it, maybe that's not the most stable configuration. Maybe the universe just might turn over, there might be some little bubble, a little fizz that knocks the universe over until it finds its true ground state, its true minimum, its true most stable configuration. We think the universe looks pretty stable. It's been like this for 13.8 billion years, but you never know. Maybe it's metastable. Maybe it's only kind of sort of stable, and you just need something to jolt it. And in that case, there'd be a random spot in the universe, maybe more than one, that would randomly transform, settle into its new ground state, and outwardly expand. There'd be an outwardly expanding sphere at the speed of light. where inside the bubble is a completely new universe with new forces, new particles, new fields, the whole deal, all new physics, and all new chemistry and all new kinds of life. And outside the bubble is our normal everyday universe. We can't see it coming because it's advancing at the speed of light until it... That's it. We call that vacuum decay. Again, we're not exactly sure because we don't know if our current vacuum is stable, if our current universe arrangement is stable. I don't know. Who knows? I'm like that's the fun part of talking about the end state of the universe is there's so many possibilities and they're based on things we can measure. If we measure dark energy better, if we measure saying things like the Higgs boson better, we can understand if our universe will undergo vacuum decay. We can understand if the Big Rip scenario is likely or not. That's what's so exciting. We get to talk about stuff that's going to happen tens of quintillions of years from now by doing measurements today. So that's our compendium of doom. If you haven't already watched part 1, go to Isaac Arthur's channel. There's a link right there. It's called Science and Futurism. Fabulous channel. You should give it a try.
If you've already seen that, don't forget to like and subscribe to both channels.
And I'm Paul Sutter. Thank you again for watching.
And this is Isaac Arthur. Thanks for joining us.
And we'll see you next time.
And those just get injected from time to time in the course. When he's nailing them 9 times out of 10, it moves on to more advanced stuff, or tells him he has proficiency, and that gets recorded in his file. Hannah does not need a second mortgage on her house to pay for his tuition and lodging, because paying a couple dozen different professors to prepare an instructional segment on a topic everyone around the planet can pick and choose from is a lot cheaper and more cost and time effective than paying one professor to stand in a room repeating the same lecture once a semester to students that may or may not be receptive to his presentation style, or have to miss a class and fall behind. There is no class to fall behind on, just subjects, and the ability to assess with solid accuracy how knowledgeable an individual person is at any time on that subject. So Hannah doesn't have much trouble falling asleep because she isn't too stressed out by life, and her personal health model can send in a signal to some of the pills left in her system to dissolve or tell her how much of something to take if she needs a hand getting to sleep. What is interesting about Sam and Hannah's lives is that they both live in a pretty automated and high-tech civilization. We spend a lot of time on this channel talking about futures in Hannah's era, or even centuries further ahead. And we tend to focus on big things, new spaceships, new energy sources, giant constructs we could build around our own star, or other stars and the ships that will get you there. Not today though. For today it does not matter that Ted was actually playing golf in a rotating habitat orbiting the Earth, complaining about how the spin throws off his normal swing. We care that his golf partner was actually lying down at home on his bed, playing with him in virtual reality, and that he, Ted, and Hannah were thousands of kilometers apart, but all felt like they were in the same environment chatting, even though they were not in the same place and quite possibly all saw different environments. We don't care that they have rocket ships with big fusion-powered drives that can get to Mars in a week. We care about them having cars they can sleep in, fully relaxed in the knowledge that it could drive through a blizzard without a risk of accident, and that if one did somehow happen, a dozen safety systems would pop on deploying airbags and restraints before the vehicle even hit the target, and that if somehow even that wasn't enough, an automated ambulance would be on the scene in moments with robots controlled by experts hundreds of kilometers away piloting them, and already knowing from the vehicle's monitors exactly what happened and where all the injuries were and how severe. We also don't particularly care that Hannah's son can do classes online. We already have ever-improving technology allowing that. We care about the automated, interactive aspect of that, something called affective computing, or computers and systems that can recognize, interpret, process, or simulate human body language and effects. Fundamentally, it is this sort of technology that holds the strongest potential to revolutionize our lives. Sure, A student can watch a recorded lecture and pick from several variations of it by other people covering that same topic, just as you can do now on YouTube, for instance. But it is a big game changer when the system can actually recognize that you are confused or distracted and act accordingly by simply bringing up a different or expanded presentation. One that can recognize what sort of voice tones and manner or accent you respond better to and suggest speakers based on that. It can even real-time alter theirs, or even perform text-to-speech functions that don't pronounce each word mechanically, but can simulate it like a normal person would say it, and possibly even produce a simulated speaker who doesn't trip all your mental flags as inhuman and disturbing. The uncanny valley, our tendency to respond more negatively to things which seem closer to human than further away, is a big hurdle to making such simulations. But if you can get past it, you open the door for books that don't just get read out loud by some cold, disjointed voice, but can be real-time performed like a TV show or interactive virtual environment without needing actors. It's a lot easier to learn the history of the world when instead of a book or lecture,
I'm about to get up out of here, guys. Appreciate everybody coming through, checking me out. I'll let y'all next time. Peace.